Our topic for today is about accounting for franchise operation. Franchisor. Learning objectives define a franchise contract, apply the general and specific principles of PFRS 15, and recognizing revenue from franchise contract. PFRS means Philippine Financial Reporting Standard. The Philippine Financial Reporting Standard (PFRS), Philippine Accounting Standard (PAS), are the new set of generally accepted accounting principles (GAAP) issued by the Accounting Standard Council (ASC) to govern the preparation of financial statements. On August 15, 2017, the Securities and Exchange Commission approved the adoptions of Philippine Financial Reporting Standard (PFRS 15) revenue from contracts with customers, which became effective for annual reporting periods beginning on or after January 1, 2018. Applicability of PFRS 15. The entity shall apply the principles set forth under PFRS 15, revenue from contracts with customer in accounting for revenues from contracts with customers, regardless of the nature of the contract entered into with a customer. Core principle. An entity recognizes revenue to defeat the transfer of promised goods or services to customer in an amount that reflects the consideration to which the entity expect to be entitled in exchange for those goods or services. So sabi dyan, an entity recognize revenue. Yung entity, kinikilala yung pagkita para ilarawan ang pagbibigay ng pangakong produkto o serbisyo sa halagang inaasahan ng entity kapalit ng ibinigay na produkto or serbisyo. Promise goods nga yan, no? Ibig sabihin ay pangako pa lang. Agreement pa lang yan. So, dapat ano yung amount na ibinibigay ng franchisor? Magkano ang i-recognize mong amount in consideration sa serbisyo at produkto na ibinigay mo? So, step in the recognition of revenue. Meron tayong PFRS 15 requires the following steps in recognizing revenue. Step 1, you need to identify the contract with the customer. The second is identify the performance obligation in the contract. Third is determine the transaction price. Fourth is allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation in the contract. Number 5 is recognize revenue when or as the entity satisfy a performance obligation. So dapat dyan malaman natin anong klaseng kontrata ba yan. Anong klaseng kontrata meron. Ano ang kailangan gawin ni entity o kailangan ibigay na produkto o serbisyo. Magkano ang halagang napagkasunduan sa kontrata. Tapos paano hinahati yung maraming obligation yan. No? Kasi allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation in the contract. Then, saka pala makakapag-recognize tayo ng revenue. Pag na-satisfy na yung satisfy a performance obligation. So, licensing. The licensing section, PFRS 15, provides specific principle that relates directly to the accounting for franchises. The specific principles are to be applied in addition to the general principles. PFRS 15 defines a license as one that establishes a customer's right to the intellectual property of an entity. Example of licenses of intellectual property include software and technology, motion picture, music, and other forms of media and entertainment, franchises and patent, trademarks, and copyrights. No? Licensing, no? Meron yung general principle, yung overtime and appointment time. No? Meron din naman tayong specific principle dyan, yung about franchising agreement. When we say intellectual property, ang entity na bibigay ng license kay customer. Ito yung right para gamitin ang property ni entity na naaayon doon sa kontrata. Franchise. A franchise is a contractual arrangement under which the franchisor grants the franchisee the right to sell certain products or services, to use certain trademarks or trade names, or to perform certain functions, usually within the designated geographical area. We deal with franchises every day. A Jollibee fast food restaurant, 7-Eleven convenience store, an FM radio station, and a public utility vehicle are all examples of franchises. Franchises are of two types: contractual arrangement between two private entities or individual contractual arrangement between a private entity or an individual and the government. Si franchisor may intellectual property. At ang intellectual property ay gustong gamitin ni franchisee. Siyempre, wala namang libre. Mabubuo ang isang kontrata, magkano ang halaga ng intellectual property para magamit at paano. Yan ay mapapaloob sa isang kontrata. Meron dalawang klase yan, no? Yung two types. Yan yung mga patent. Una, yan yung mga patent, copyright, trademarks. Yung pangalawa, yan yung para mga prangkisa, no? Na halimbawa yung prangkisa ng ABS-CBN sa paggamit ng gobyerno. Pinapagamit ng gobyerno ang ABS-CBN sa airwaves para sa national broadcasting. Kaya lang, nung hindi ito na-renew, hindi ka na pwedeng mag-broadcast. Yan yung pangalawa. Sunod tayo. The franchisor, having developed unique concept or product, protects the concept or product through a patent, copyright, or trademarks or trade name. The franchisee acquires the right to exploit the franchisor's idea or product by signing a franchise agreement. Yan nga yun, gagamit ka ng franchise agreement kasi gusto mo magamit yung sistema ni franchisor, no? Para hindi ka na mahirapan mag-isip ng produkto, makita mo mag-train ng tao. So, lahat magagamit mo yan sa pamagitan ng franchising, no? At yan ipapagamit sa iyo pag nagkaroon kayo ng kontrata. Between a private entity or individual and the government, another type of franchise agreement, municipality or other government body allows a private entity to use public property in performing its services. Example, the use of public waterways in a ferry service. Yan na nga yun, no? Yung pangalawa, pwedeng paggamit ng gobyerno yung tubig, yan, may bayad din yan. So, yan ay franchise din, no? Papagamit sa iyo yung telephone or electric lines. So, pwede rin yan. Sabi dito, the use of public water o ferry service, use of public land for telephone or electric lines, or use of phone lines for cable TV, use of city street for bus line, or use of the airwaves for radio or TV broadcasting. Such operating rights obtained through agreement with governmental units. Kailangan meron kang kontrata sa government. Are frequently referred to as license or permits. Minsan tawag dyan prangkisa sa Tagalog, no? Kahit yung mga, ibig sabihin yung mga toda na may lugar sila na kung saan nagsasakay ng mga tao, prangkisa din yan. Franchises and licenses may be for the definite period of time or for an indefinite period of time or perpetual. Let's go to the application of the principles of PFRS 15. Step 1, identify the contract with the customer. A contract with the customer is accounted for only when all of the following criteria are met. Kailangan lahat, no? When all the following criteria are met. Letter A, the contracting parties have approved the contract in writing, orally or implied in customary business practices and are committed to perform their respective obligation. Letter B, the entity can identify each party's right regarding the goods or services to be transferred. Letter C, the entity can identify the payment terms for the goods or services to be transferred. Letter D, the contract has commercial substance. The risk, timing, or amount of the entity future cash flow is expected to change as a result of the contract. The consideration, letter E, the consideration the contract is probable of collection when assessing collectibility. The entity shall consider only the customer's ability and intention to pay the consideration on due date. Ibig sabihin yan, dapat may pinagkasunduan na, may kontrata na at payag na gawin ng bawat isang parties ang obligasyon. Tapos malinaw na alam nila ang obligasyon nila, alam na rin kung magkano at paano ang bayaran. Batid na rin na magbabago ang cash flow bunga ng mga transaksyon. Dapat may makokolekta, no? Dapat may kagustuhan at kakayahan ang franchisee na magbayad. Yan yung napapaloob doon sa application of the principles, no? O PFRS 15, step 1. So, yan yon. So, kailangan mag-recognize na revenue. Walang recognize na revenue kung di ma-meet ang criteria, no? Kasi may criteria tayo. Paano kung may na-receive ka ng consideration? Yung consideration, kung na-receive mo na, will be recognized as contract liability. Itong papasok yan, parang unearned revenue. Na-perform o nagawa mo na ang mga dapat mong gawin, dapat, no? Pagkatapos ng kontrata, pwede nang i-consider, no? Halimbawa, yung kontrata mo ay non-refundable, yan, pwede na mag-consider na revenue niya. So, application for the principle of PFRS 15 Step 1. No revenue is recognized in the contract that does not meet the criteria above. Any consideration received from such contract is recognized as liability. Yun ang sinasabi natin, papasok yan sa liability. As a liability and recognized as revenue only when either the following has occurred, no? Magiging revenue lang pag na-meet na yung letter A and B. Ano yung A? The entity has no remaining obligation to transfer good or service to the customer and all or substantially all of the consideration has been received and is non-refundable. Or letter B, the contract has been terminated and the considerable received is non-refundable. Yan na yun. So, punta tayo sa step 2. Ang step 2 is identify the performance obligation in the contract. So, meron tayong general principles. Each promise to transfer the following is a performance obligation to be accounted for separately. Letter A distinct good or service or a distinct bundle of goods or services. Letter B, a series of distinct goods or services that are substantially the same and have the same pattern of transfer to the customer. So, pag sinabi natin yung A, no, distinct, yan ay individual. No? Pag yung mga isa ay kino-combine natin yung letter B. Kasi yung isa ay pwedeng ihiwalay. Kasi nahihiwalay siya. Yung isa kailangan isama. Kino-combine yung letter B. Identifying distinct goods or services. Paano natin malalaman? No? Identifying distinct goods or services. A good or service is distinct if the customer can benefit from it, either on its own or together with other resources that are readily available to the customer. Example, the goods or service is regularly sold separately. Ano pa, letter V? The good or service is separately identifiable. Not an input to a combined output does not significantly modify the other promises or not highly interrelated with the other promises. A good or service that is not distinct shall not be combined with the other promises in the contract. Combined promises are treated as a single performance obligation. So, meron lang yan. Yung letter A is customer can benefit from it and the other one is separately identifiable. Application for the principles of PFRS 15. Satisfaction of performance obligation. At contract inception, the entity shall determine whether the identified performance obligation will be satisfied either A, over time or at the point in time. So, dalawa lang yan, no? Over time or at a point in time. A performance obligation is satisfied over time if one of the following criteria is met. Overtime ang tawag dito kung yung isa, sabi dyan, if one of the following criteria is met. The customer simultaneously consumes the benefits provided by the entity's performance as the entity performs. B, the entity's performance create or enhance the asset. Example, work in progress, that the customer controls the asset is created or enhanced. Letter C, the entity performance does not create an asset with an alternative use to the identity, and the entity has an enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date. If the entity cannot demonstrate that the performance obligation is satisfied over time, it is presumed that the performance obligation is satisfied at the point in time. Pag hindi pa yan over time, Yan is at a point in time, no? So tinitingnan natin yung bawat promise, no? The promise kung not distinct or distinct. Kapag not distinct, single performance yan. Ginugroup natin as one. Kung na-meet ang mga criteria, actual overtime. Kung hindi naman na-meet, no? At a point in time. Number 2, kapag distinct, separate performance obligation. Mag-isa. Punta sa specific principles, no? May right to access ba? Yan yung mga ano, no? Tapos, meron bang right to use? Pag pumunta tayo doon, no? Punta tayo sa specific principles. Application of the principles of PFRS 15 is specific principle licensing. A contract to grant a license to customer may include other promise to provide additional goods or services to the customer, whether explicitly stated in the contract or implied by the entity's customary business practice. Just like with other type of contracts, the entity shall apply the general principle in steps 2 above to identify each of the performance obligation in the contract. Let's continue. Ito yon. Application of the principle PFRS 15 Step 2, specific principles. Promise to grant license, no? Meron tayong not distinct saka distinct. Pag sinabi natin not distinct, treat all promises in the contract as a single performance obligation. Single performance lang. Use general principle to determine whether the performance obligation is satisfied over time or at a point in time. Pag naman distinct, treat the promise to grant this license as separate performance obligation. Ibig sabihin nun, hiwalay, no? Treat the promise to grant the license as separate performance obligation. Use a specific principle to determine if the promise provides the customer right to access. Right to access, pag sinabi natin right to access, performance obligation is satisfied over time. Revenue is recognized over the license period. Yung revenue niya over the license period yan. Pag right to use, performance obligation is satisfied at a point in time. Revenue is recognized at the time when the license is provided. No, nire-recognize na yung revenue pag naibigay na yung lisensya. So, yan yun. Malalaman natin kung not distinct or distinct. Makikita natin sa sample mamaya yan, no? So, specific principles naman, ang application of the principles na step 2, ito yung naman tinitingnan natin kung right to access or right to use. Pag sinabi natin right to access, the customer cannot direct the use of the obtained substantially all of the remaining benefits from the license of the point in the time at which the license is granted. Intellectual property changes throughout the license period. The entity continues to be involved with the intellectual property, and the entity undertakes activities that significantly affect the intellectual property. May be evidenced by sales-based royalty agreement between the entity and the customer. Pag right to access, no? Ibig sabihin yan ay right to access. Pinapagamit lang sa iyo. Parang pinapahiram lang sa iyo. Ang kumpletong control niya, nandun pa rin sa franchisor. Pag sinabi natin right to use, the customer can direct the use of and obtain substantially all of the remaining benefits from the license at the point in time at which the license is granted. Pag nabigyan ka ng lisensya, magagamit mo na yon. Ikaw na yung may control. Intellectual property IP does not change throughout the license period. Yung isa parang pinapahiram, ito parang nasa iyo na. Ikaw na yung mayroong rights sa buong business na yon, no? Ikaw na nagde-decide doon, ikaw na nagmamanufacture, ganyan. Application for principles, step 2. Illustration, identifying distinct license. The entity of pharmaceutical company licensed to a customer its patent rights to an approved drug compound for 10 years and also promise to manufacture the drug for the customer. The drug is mature product, therefore the entity will not undertake any activities to support the drug which is consistent with its customary business practice. No, illustration, no. Illustration na nito. So ulitin natin. Yung entity, a pharmaceutical company, licenses to a customer. Nagbigay ng license sa isang customer, its patents right to an approved drug compound for 10 years, 10 taon ang kontrata niyan. And also promises to manufacture the drug for the customer. Sila magmamanufacture ng drug para doon sa customer nila. Sila ang gagawa. Di-deliver na lang doon sa customer. The drug is a mature product. Wala ka nang gagawin doon. Ibig sabihin, finished product na yon. Hindi mo na i-improve yan. No? Wala kang karapatan mag-improve. Ikaw ay bibigay lang sa iyong produktor. Therefore, the entity will not undertake any activity to support the drug, which is consistent with its customary business practices. Yan. So, ang pupunta natin, step 2. Kasi identify the performance obligation in the contract. Yan. Concept. Each promised goods or service that is distinct is treated as a separate performance obligation. A good or service distinct if the customer can benefit from it on its own and it's separately identifiable from the other promises in the contract. Analysis. The promises are not individually distinct because the customer cannot benefit from the license without the manufacturer service. The promises are highly interrelated and does not separately identifiable. Ibig sabihin, hindi separate identifiable. Hindi ito pwede mag-isa. Dapat ito ay magkasama, no? So, dapat isama ito. Bakit? Sabi diyan, the customer cannot benefit from the license. Walang halaga yung license without the manufacturing services. Kung hindi mabibigay ng manufacturing services kasi hindi nila mapoproduce yung product. Conclusion, the promises are treated as single performance obligation. It is a single performance obligation. The entity determines whether the single performance obligation is satisfied over time. So, pag-usapan naman natin, ito pa ay satisfied over time or at a point in time. Using the general principle. The entity does not apply the specific principle to determine whether the customer has the right to access or right to use the entity's intellectual property. Under the general principle, the simple performance obligation is satisfied over time because the customer simultaneously receive and consume the benefits of the entity's performance as it occurs. As the entity provides the manufacturing services. Siyempre, 10 years yan, bibigyan sila ng product, ng drugs sa 10 taon, continuous yan. At kung continuous yan, yan ay overtime ang tawag doon, no? Phase 2, license is distinct. The manufacturing process used to produce the drug is not unique or specialized, and several other entities can also manufacture the drug for the customer. Application for the general principle. The promises to provide the license and the manufacturing service are distinct because the customer can benefit from the license without the manufacturing services, and the promises are separately identifiable from each other. Conclusion, there are two separate performance obligations in the contract. Ano ito? Yung license of patent rights and manufacturing services. Yung dalawang yan. The entity determines whether each of the performance obligation is satisfied over time or at point in time. Since the license is distinct, the entity applies the specific principle to determine whether the customer has the right to access or right to use the entity's intellectual property. So, ito yun, no? Application of the specific principles, concept, right to access. Customer cannot direct the use of and obtain all the benefits from the license at grant date. Intellectual property changes throughout the license period may be evidenced by a sales-based royalty agreement. Right to use, customer can direct the use of and obtain all the benefits from the license at grant date. Intellectual property does not change throughout the license period. Analysis, the license qualified with this one because of the following statement. the drug is a mature product. Hindi mo na nga babaguhin yung mature na yung finished product na yon. Therefore, the entity will not undertake any activities to support the drug. From the statement above, it can be inferred that the intellectual property does not change throughout the license period. Conclusion: the customer has the right to use the entity's intellectual property as it exists at a point in time. Accordingly, the performance obligation to provide the license is satisfied at a point in time. Application for the principles, no? Step 3, determine the transaction price. The transaction price is the amount of consideration to which an entity is expected to be entitled in exchange for transferring promised goods or services to a customer, excluding amount collected on behalf of third parties, some sale taxes. The transaction price is normally the contract price. However, the transaction price may not be equal to the contract price if the consideration of the contract is affected by any of the following. Pwede magkaiba yan pag yan ay affected nitong mga ito. A. Variable consideration. B. Constraining estimate variables. Consideration and entity exempt from applying this principle on sales-based or usage-based royalty. Letter C, the existence of significant financing component in the contract. Letter D, non-cash consideration. Tapos letter E, consideration payable to customer. So, the transaction price in a franchise contract is commonly referred to as price fees, no? Pag tinawag natin price fees, meron yan tatlo. Price fees. Price fees refer to the fees that the franchisee agrees to pay. Yan yung napagkasundo ang bayaran to the franchisor. Pabayaran nila sa franchisor in a franchise agreement. Doon sa kontrata nila. The fees may cover the supply to know-how. Kung paano ginagawa, yan, andyan yun. Initial and subsequent services and equipment and other tangible assets. So, franchise fee come in the form of number 1, initial franchise fee. Ito yung initial franchise fee ang tawag. This is the one-off payment made by the franchisee to the franchisor to obtain the franchise right, para magkaroon siya ng right, no? Initial franchise fee are normally paid at the signing of the franchise agreement and are normally non-refundable. Normally, hindi to refundable. Pero pwede rin, conforme sa kontrata nakalagay, pero normally, hindi nga ito refundable. However, some franchise agreement allow initial franchise fee to be paid over an extended period of time and provide for the rights of refund up to a certain amount. Aside from consideration for the supply of know-how, initial franchise fee may also cover for the franchisor initial service in existing the franchisees in establishing the new business. Example for initial service include the following. Ano-ano yun? Assistant in site selection, lease negotiation, financing, fitting out of the premises and supervision of the construction activity. B. Initial training in operating the business, assistance with staff recruitment and training, access to preferential purchasing arrangement the franchisor has put in place, provision of system, and yung accounting information and quality control, advertisement and promotion, preparation for execution of grand opening, initial presence of a troubleshooter for the first few days after the opening. Ikalawa, continuing franchise fee. So, initial yung isa, yung pangalawa, continue, no? Continuing franchise fee. These are the periodic payments made by the franchisee to the franchisor for the ongoing franchisee support. Continuing franchise fee are also referred to as royalty fees. Ayan ang tawag dyan. And are usually based on a certain percentage of the franchisee sales, but can also be set up as fixed amount or on sliding scales and are payable periodically. So, depende rin ito. Pwede itong percentage of the sales, yung royalty fees. Yan ay continuous hanggang ginagamit mo yung nandun ka sa loob ng kontrata ng franchise, no? Continue yan, taon-taon. It can be 5%, 10% per year. Ang sabi dyan. Pero pwede namang iba. Pwede nakapix lang yan. Halimbawa, 50,000 per year. Pwede din yan. O kaya sliding. Bumababa. No? Pwede. Depende sa kontrata yan. Sliding and are payable periodically. In some cases, continuing franchise fee may be charged separately for the following. Para saan yun, no? Yung franchise fee niya, no? Management fees, this may primarily for ongoing franchise support and are usually calculated as percentage franchisee sales. Training and conferences fees, accounting and other special service fees. In some franchises, the franchisor provide bookkeeping service or maintains the information system of franchisees. Separate fees may be charged for these services. Pwedeng hiwalay ang bayad sa mga service na yan. Marketing services fund additional fee may be charged as contribution to the national product, advertising, and marketing activities of the franchisor. Renewal fund. A fund may be established to cover for the renewal fee of the franchise when it expires. Pag nag-expire, pwedeng i-renew yung agreement, no? At pwedeng may renewal fund. Pangatlo, sale of equipment and other tangible asset. In most franchise agreement, the franchisor provides equipment and other tangible asset to the franchisee for a separate fee. Also, the franchisor may purchase goods centrally and supply direct to franchisee and markup. A markup purchasing fee or handling fee may be charged on tangible asset transferred to franchisees. Normally, no, yung ibang mga yung mga equipment mismo sila rin ang nagbebenta. Yung mga franchisor dun sa franchisee. Bakit? Kasi mas maganda ngayon kasi yung quality hindi mawawala kasi yung franchise ay pahiram, no? Pinapahiram sa iyo minsan yung rights. So, dapat yung quality, even yung quality ng product, hindi mawala. At yung quality ng product minsan naandun din sa nanggagaling din dun sa mga equipment. Kung hindi maganda yung mga equipment na ginagamit mo, ay maaari maapektuhan yung quality of product. So, yung equipment, binebenta rin ng mga franchisor normally. At naglalagay na lang sila doon ng mababang kita. At dahil naman yun ay nabibili na nila ng maramihan kasi lahat naman nung nagpa-franchise sa kanila kumukuha din nung equipment. So, sometimes meron yan separate fee, no? Minsan, pati yung mga goods, ganun din. Yung mga additional goods na sa kanila na rin lahat yan. Kasi yung quality nga ang tinitingnan dyan. Kasi kung hindi, mawawala, magkakaiba-iba yung lasa ng produkto kung yan ay pagkain. Step 4, allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation. Kasi may mga, The transaction price is allocated to the performance obligations. Marami yan. Based on the relative standalone prices of the distinct goods or services, the standalone selling price is the price at which a promised good or services can be sold separately to a customer. If there's only one performance obligation in a contract, the transaction price is allocated only to the single obligation. Kung meron lang iisang single obligation doon sa kontrata, of course, doon lang yon. Kaya lang, dahil marami tayong performance obligation, we need to allocate the transaction price. No, hahati-hatiin yan kung magkano per performance obligation. Step 5, recognize revenue when or as performance obligation is satisfied. The performance obligation is satisfied when the control over promised goods or service is transferred to the customer. If the performance obligation, the contract is satisfied over time, revenue is recognized over time as the entity progresses towards the complete satisfaction of the obligation. The performance obligation, the contract is satisfied at a point in time, the entity recognizes revenue when the performance obligation is satisfied. Revenue is measured at the amount at the transaction price allocated to the satisfied performance obligation. So, yung revenue natin na may measure at the amount of the transaction price allocated to the satisfied performance obligation. Pwede itong overtime, pwede itong at a point in time. So, makikita natin sa sample mamaya yan. Ito yung sample, illustration. Accounting for franchise fee. On January 1, 2000, let's say 2021, ABC Company grants franchises the right to operate restaurant in a specific location using ABC trade name, concept and menu over a 10-year period, 10 taon yan. The franchise agreement states an upfront fee of $1,200,000, which includes $200,000 for kitchen equipment. Kasama na dun yung $200,000 na kitchen equipment that ABC will purchase for the franchisee, place 10% royalty based on the franchisee sales. The $200,000 amount reflects the standalone selling price of the equipment. ABC regularly undertakes the activities such as marketing research, product development, advertising campaigns, and implementing operational efficiencies and pricing strategy to support franchise name. ABC delivers the equipment on February 1, 2001. The restaurant opened on April 1, 2001, at which date the license period started to run. The franchisee reports sales of 9 million for the year. So, isang taon niya, 9 million. Provide journal entries. So, titingnan muna natin yung mga promises dito. No? Ano yung mga pangako doon sa loob ng kontrata. So, let's go to step 2 analysis kasi hindi natin kailangan yung step 1. Identify the performance obligation in the contract. The promises to grant a franchise license and to transfer the kitchen equipment are distinct because the customer can benefit from each promise on their own or together with other resources that are readily available. Example, the equipment can be used in the franchise or sold for an amount other than scrap value. The franchise license and equipment are separately identifiable. The supportive activities, example, marketing, research, etc., are not performance obligation because this does not directly transfer goods or service to the franchisee. Rather, this part of ABC's promise to grant the license and in effect change the intellectual property to which the franchisee has right. Conclusion, there are two separate obligations in the contract. Ano yon? Yung franchise license and equipment. Yan yung dalawang separate obligation. Bagamat may tatlong promises doon. The entity determines whether each performance obligation is satisfied over time or at a point in time. Franchisee license. Since the license is distinct, ABC applies the specific principle to determine whether the franchisee has the right to access or right to use ABC intellectual property. The problem states that ABC undertakes activities to support the franchise accordingly. The franchisee can validly expect that its right will change. For example, the right to sell additional product that ABC might introduce in the future. Conclusion, the customer has the right to access and thus the performance obligation is satisfied over time. Yan ang conclusion. No? Meron lang siyang right to access. No? And thus the performance obligation is satisfied over time. Ibig sabihin, ang may control pa rin dyan yung franchisor. Number 2, equipment. The entity applies the general principles to determine whether the performance obligation to transfer the equipment is satisfied over time or at a point in time. Since control over the equipment transferred to the customer upon delivery, the performance obligation is satisfied at a point in time. Yung pag-deliver nila, sabi niyan, since control over the equipment transferred to the customer upon delivery, the performance obligation is satisfied at a point in time. Yung equipment naman, yan ay at a point in time. Yan yung i-record later on natin. Step 3, determine the transaction price. The transaction price includes a fixed consideration of 1.2 million and a variable consideration for the sales-based royalty. Merong sales-based royalty. Yan ang natin, no? Sa price. Allocate the transaction price to the obligation. 1.2 million upfront fee is allocated as follows. 200K to the equipment because this reflects the stand-alone selling price. 1 million balance to the franchise license. Kasi magkasama na dun sa 1.2 million, yung 200,000 na equipment. Then meron pa, nakalagay doon, 10% sales-based royalty is allocated entirely to the franchise license. Number 5, recognize revenue when or as an obligation is satisfied. 200,000 is recognized as revenue when the equipment is transferred to the franchisee. So, na-recognize na revenue yun, nabigay na doon sa franchisee yung equipment. For the 1 million, ABC applies the general principle to determine the measure progress, the best defeat its performance. Because the contract provides the franchisee with the unlimited use of ABC intellectual property for a fixed term ng 10 years. 10 taon kasi yan, an appropriate measure progress may be a time-based method. Straight line method, normal naman ang ginagamit. Start to amortize 1 million on April 1. No? The commencement of the franchise's business because it is on this date that the franchisee is able to use and obtain the economic benefit from the license. No? Tapos, the sales-based royalty is recognized as the sales occur. Ganun lang yun. So, journal entries natin. Ito, January 1, cash. No? Meron tayong 1.2 million. Debit yan, cash. 1.2 million. Credit, Contract liability, 1.2 million. To record the receipt of the initial franchise fee. Kasi nga, hindi pa natin pwedeng i-record yan as revenue. No? Kasi meron tayong mga kailangan pang emit. February 1, 2001, contract liability naman, debit 200,000. Ito yung sa kitchen equipment. No? Pwede na nating i-recognize na revenue. No, credit a revenue 200,000 to recognize revenue from initial franchise fee allocated to kitchen equipment of February 1. December 31, contract liability. So meron tayong 1 million divided by 10 years. So meron lang yan na siyam na buwan. So ang gagawin natin dyan, 1 million divided by 10 years multiplied by 9 and 12 divided by 12 to recognize the revenue from the initial franchise fee allocated to the franchise license. 75,000 yan. So contract liability, debit na natin para ma-recognize ang revenue. Tapos ng siyam na buwan. Tapos ang credit ay revenue 75,000. December 31 naman tayo. Oo, according doon, meron tayong ilang million yon, no? 9 million na sales. And meron tayong dapat na i-recognize na revenue. So debit natin ang cash, credit natin ang revenue no 900,000 to recognize revenue from the sales-based royalty. Yan na yon. So yan, hanggang dyan lang tayo. Ito lang yung isang sample, masyado na mahaba. So susunod yung ibang sample natin. Thank you.